I really feel that in order to be successful, a person needs to be able to own where they are and see it themselves. And so I see myself as a guide along that process.
Welcome to another episode of Contrabass Conversations, your show covering life on the low end of the spectrum. I'm your host, Jason Heath. So glad to have you here today, and visit our site at contrabassconversations.com for all the details about what's going on. I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, feedback@contrabassconversations.com. Let me know a suggestion for the show, a guest idea. That would be great. And I know you're going to love today's episode featuring Tracy Rowell. Tracy's somebody that I've had so many people over the past few months recommend as a guest, and that's always a sure sign that I've got to sit down and do an interview with them. Tracy's an active performer and teacher in the Cleveland area. She was previously assistant principal bass for the National Arts Centre Orchestra in Ottawa, Canada, and she currently teaches at Oberlin, as well as serving as principal bass of CityMusic Cleveland. She's subbed with the Boston Symphony, Boston Pops. She's a frequent clinician all over the country. We dig into these topics as well as what it was like studying with Paul Ellison and Ed Barker, moving to Ohio after her husband, Henry Perbrun, got a job in the Cleveland Orchestra, and how that sort of launched her teaching career, attending one of George Vance's summer bass workshops, and how inspiring that was, and then starting to teach 5-year-olds the bass. The Suzuki mother tongue concept, focusing on sound and how critical it is when you're teaching beginners, and all sorts of other topics. It was such a pleasure to sit down and talk with Tracy. I know you're going to love this conversation. And we'll be hearing some excerpts from Tracy performing in a variety of contexts throughout the episode. So I know you'll enjoy that too. And we have links in the show notes so you can find the complete recordings for those. I'd also like to thank D'Addario Strings for sponsoring Contrabass Conversations. And I'd love to have you enter our latest giveaway at contrabassconversations.com/strings. D'Addario is giving away a set of the orchestra, pizzicato, and hybrid strings. These strings are engineered, designed, and crafted at the D'Addario String Factory in New York. And hosting for Contrabass Conversations is provided by Bass Capos, which are a great choice for any bass player looking to implement a double bass extension. They're easy to install, easy to adjust, cheaper and more reliable than hand-built latches, and they're light and quick to operate. You can learn more at basscapos.com. All right, I know you're going to enjoy this conversation featuring Tracy Rowell. So you grew up in Houston. Maybe just give us like the early years of Tracy, like starting the bass or whatever your first musical instrument was, just kind of there onward to eventually studying with Paul.
Okay. Well, for me, actually, I grew up in a musical family. My dad is still an active teacher in Houston. He teaches the clarinet, and he's on the faculty at the University of Houston. I started on piano. That was my first instrument. But when I was in the 6th grade, my mother, who was a very fine Eastman School of Music trained violinist, got a job teaching public school music in my school district. And my parents actually bribed me to play the bass because she had no bass players in her program. And so I got a weekly allowance to play. I remember after 1 year telling my mother that this was the most boring instrument ever. I thought that I knew all the notes. I knew all of half position and first position, and I wanted to quit. And they upped my salary if I would practice a certain amount of minutes per week. And so anyway, eventually it caught on, and I started studying with a graduate student of Paul's. And that's how I got introduced to Paul. So, and I actually had the great fortune of studying with Paul starting in my sophomore year of high school, all the way through graduating from Rice. So
that's great. I think you're the first person I've ever talked to who was, a gigging musician. Like your allowance was tied into your bass playing for early on.
Yeah, the allowance eventually went away, but there you have it.
And so talking to people last year, 2016, I think the most common topic that came up was Paul Ellison. I think he was the number one. Number two was George Vance, I think. So So, and I know you have a lot of experience, obviously studying with Paul and then working the Vance method. And I know that these are like impossible to answer questions, like these wide questions. But like, if you think of Paul just as like a teacher, what are some of the first things that come to mind?
Oh boy, it is. There's so many things that you could say. I would say the first thing that comes to my mind is the phrase comprehensive knowledge. Mm-hmm. He just has such a wide background, having, grown up in Chicago and gotten a really strong training with, the greats like Warren Benfield and being principal bass of the Houston Symphony. But I think Paul is an example of someone who is very musically curious. So he didn't just figure out one way that works for him. He seems to be curious about how different schools, different bow holds, different ways of approaching the instrument, how that all works. And so it's interesting because, I went off to grad school and then I got a job playing in orchestra. And then I got, as my life has, moved on, progressed. And then I kind of got back in touch with Paul. I hadn't watched him teach for a long time. And the first time I watched him teach after, I'd say I probably hadn't seen him teach for at least 10 or 15 years. He was doing different things, and I studied with him for a long time. So I knew all the stuff that he was into back then, but he's continued to evolve in his understanding of pedagogy. And, it's just amazing to be around.
Talk us through, so you're at Rice and then you end up going and studying with Ed. And what were a couple of the differences just in terms of pedagogy, in terms of the notable differences between those two schools of study?
It's kind of hard to describe, but I feel like at the time that I went to Ed, Paul had set me up pretty well, and I could play lots of notes, and I had gone to Ed because I really wanted to polish my orchestral training and prepare to audition for orchestras. And that was what was single most on my mind. And so I basically felt like I was just trying to be a sponge. I was trying to listen to how he played things and how he sounded and see if I could figure out how to do that. And so, the first experiences, I still remember my first few lessons with him once I moved to Boston, bringing in Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, the recitatives, and then all the other hard stuff that's in there. And, having the notes pretty well down and thinking, well, I know I need to take this to the next level, and I'm not quite sure how to do that. And then him picking up the bass and sounding like that, and that's when I just knew, that's what I wanted to sound like him.
Yeah.
He's just a really good example. He's an example of a great player, a great leader, a good person.
So you're in grad school and you're studying with Ed, and then maybe just take us through the various stages you've gone through in your career, like from there to where you are now, in terms of like professional jobs, how your teaching developed, that kind of thing.
Uh-huh. Well, at the time that I was in undergraduate school and in graduate school, I actually had no interest in teaching whatsoever. Although talking to Paul, and looking back, I can see that he was kind of planting seeds. But I had no interest in it. My parents were teachers, and I saw how hard my mother worked as a public school teacher, and I thought, that's too hard. I can't do that. And I was just really focused on playing. So, I was studying with Ed, and, I felt like he really, really prepared me. I started to do well in auditions and became an active freelancer in the Boston area. And, pretty much right out of school, got a job playing in the National Arts Centre Orchestra in Ottawa, Canada. I was assistant principal bass there for a few years in the 1990s. And, life happens while you're making plans. So there I was in that job, and my husband who happened to be principal bass of that orchestra, Henry Pearbrun, got a job offered to him in the Cleveland Orchestra. And we had, at that time, we had, one daughter, and we were expecting our second. And so, that's how we came to move to the Cleveland area. And it wasn't until after we moved to Cleveland that I started, doing any teaching at all. It was even kind of accidental. Someone, just recommended me to do some classes, and then I started to get students. And, I found that I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I did. And also sort of at that same time, George Vance invited Henry and me to come teach at one of his summer bass workshops. And I just was so inspired. I felt like I got so much from the students and from being around all the other, amazing teachers and getting to know George. And then the third thing that happened was that George came to the Cleveland area and he did a teacher training workshop at Baldwin Wallace College, mostly for the music education students that were studying with my husband at the time. And that was the first time that I had seen actually a picture of where his books begin and where they end. And he went through, it took a whole weekend. It was kind of like a crash course. He went through all the teaching points and talked about how he's, the students on one piece, but he's preparing them for a couple pieces coming up, and the left-hand concepts, how one thing builds onto another. I guess I had just had a really big misconception about that before. And so things kind of started to click for me. The fourth thing that happened was our oldest daughter started studying Suzuki cello at the Cleveland Institute of Music. And it was just so wonderful to sit in the lessons. And she's actually graduating from the University of Michigan in Richard Aaron's class right now. But at age 4, I was watching the teacher, masterfully work with her. And I was thinking, this, absolutely all of this could work on the bass. Why isn't this happening more? And so that made me interested to start teaching younger students.
So at that point, you started teaching the younger crowd?
Yes. Yeah. At that point, I think I was teaching, the kind of the normal middle school, high school students that a lot of bass teachers have. But I was really curious to find out if I could start a group of younger students. And so one barrier to that was that there were no little instruments in the area. And George actually, out of the kindness of his heart, reopened his rental program and sent 4 basses to Cleveland on the Greyhound bus in boxes, and made it possible for me to start my first group of 5-year-olds at the Cleveland Institute of Music.
Wow. So you're teaching 5-year-olds on these 4 basses, and I used to be a high school orchestra director, so I'm very familiar with, how I'd go see like the big Suzuki concert in Chicago. They'd rent out Symphony Center. So how did you structure that? Did you do like a group class and then an individual class, or how did you set up that program?
Well, each kid got a half an hour private lesson sometime during the week, and then we met for a group class on Saturday mornings. And it's great. I still have a program there at CIM, and it's so wonderful to have the basses included with the other stringed instruments. They can have theory class, and they have 3 different youth orchestras ranging from beginning level up through, kind of like at a more advanced chamber orchestra type thing.
I resisted teaching as well. Both my parents were teachers, and I really didn't want to teach, and kind of fell into it and started to really enjoy it. And then went and was an orchestra director for a while and didn't teach private bass. So I'm sort of back in teaching a lot of private bass, really working with younger students, not that young, not 5, but 6th grade, 7th grade, and starting them in the Vance books, and I'm just having such a blast. Before that, I was like going through Simandl with the double sharps and all that sort of stuff, half position. And I think everybody, me and them, are having a much better time working with the Vance books. And I just love to know, like, how, in terms of reading and that sort of thing. So in your program, are they getting that not in the private lesson? Are they doing like a theory class in addition to the private lesson in the group class?
Yes, my students, a private lesson with me, a group class with me, and then they're also involved in a theory program.
Okay.
I think, I remember hearing things about the Suzuki method kind of through my mother, who was a violinist, and then, as I, grew up in my bass playing, just kind of hearing about it. The mother tongue concept of the Suzuki method is brilliant. It kind of goes along with what Dr. Suzuki said, which was, every Japanese child learns to speak Japanese. And so if you think of music as a language and how children learn language, they spend a lot of time listening to people talking when they're babies. And then they start vocalizing, and then they figure out how to talk. And then they figure out how to read. That's the Suzuki method. That's sort of the concept there. But I think what people need to remember is that, number one, at the time that this method was started, all Japanese children were taught how to read music in school. That's one thing. Another thing was the Suzuki violin method I learned in a class was all the books were designed to be completed by the time a child was age 6. So that there was still plenty of time left to learn how to read music and to expand into different kinds of repertoire. And I think with the George Vance method, you probably know from teaching that, for example, he starts in the neck block position, and thumb position is introduced before half position, which is kind of a departure from, the upbringing that I had in my early years, which was, Simandl. And George said, if he could get a kid to not play an orchestra until after that point, then he'd be happier. So it was designed, to give someone a formation on the bass. And then George also designed a technique book, the vademecum, to go along with those books. And so, obviously no method is complete, and I think a teacher needs to supplement and meet the needs of the student that they have, or whatever their needs are at their particular age and stage.
Well, I love that vademecum book. I've used that, and I've always struggled kind of with when to incorporate it or how to incorporate it, because so many of the bass students, it's so great to have a program where you're starting them at age 5, but so many people, what's your standard kind of bass teacher setup still is like someone comes to you in 8th grade and they're going to have lessons, and they have all these weird habits, and they've got their orchestra music with D flat in it. And I just struggle with what to even start with them on. If you get older students like that, do you take them back to the very beginning of the Vance method and kind of build them up like that? Or do you try to meet them where they're at? I really have a hard time figuring out what to do in terms of that.
Well, it's funny because when I was first faced with that situation, I thought, well, I can't start them at the beginning because they'll be offended that I'm asking them to play Twinkle. And so I tried to do Simandl, and I tried to do, maybe jump into the middle of the books, but then they hadn't had any thumb position, and that was way too hard. And so I realized that their progress was very slow, and that actually, if I could take them to the beginning and just go through the material really fast, you know what I mean? I kind of have more success doing it that way. I do also, with an older student, will work out of, some of them are working out of a strings method book in class, or if they have orchestra, I'm definitely doing, scales and their orchestra music. So kind of trying to juggle things. So I think it's hard.
I've tried to jump in so many times, and especially before I really sat down and thought about it, I'd this is about where you're at, and I'd open up, book 2 or something. We'd start there, and there'd just be all these holes in their learning, because it's such a sequential, it makes so much sense. Every piece, just builds, adds one little thing. So I've been trying. Okay, that's great to hear that's what you do. I've been trying to do the same thing, go back to Twinkle, and it's these are just exercises, and we're just gonna, move through this fairly rapidly.
I have one student who's in that boat. He's a beginner, but he's in the 9th grade, and he sings in one of a really good youth chorus, and so he knows quite a bit about music and reading, and so we're working out of volumes 1 and volume 2 right now, and going through volume 1 really quickly so he can play more of the things in volume 2. So.
How do you work on sound with younger players? Like, how do you get them thinking about the sound? I know that's like it seems like a key thing that a lot of people that were connected with George talk about in their teaching. Like, do you have some exercises you do, or is it just like a way you approach those early pieces?
Well, this is interesting because this is where my experience with Paul ties into how I produce the sound, and then how then I share that with even my youngest student. I feel like it's important to take the time to set up a student, even a really tiny student, and to help them to learn to do that. That I would say that sound is the most important thing, maybe even more important than reading or anything else at the beginning. So I actually took a Suzuki cello teacher training class from a lady named Tanya Carey, who was completely brilliant. And she's very much into Alexander technique. And at the time I studied with Paul, he was into yoga, and I took some classes, and I've done Pilates. And so the physical approach that this pre-Twinkle teacher was teaching so it was a teacher training class, and she has a brilliant method for setting up cello students. She says that 90 or 95% of playing the cello happens pre-Twinkle. So if you can get a student set up well from the very beginning, take the time to do it, they actually will go faster in general in the rest of their life. And so we play games. We play games with the younger students, mostly to help them find a physical experience of what it's like. So they have a muscle memory of it. They have an oral experience of it. The first time that Tanya Carey said she makes her students, they do 500 bow holds before they're allowed to pick up the cello. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, my students will never do that. And then 500 more bow holds, and then they can start putting their hands together on the cello. So that's 1,000 times they've made a bow hold. Now, that seemed, completely bizarre to me. But then I actually did it with my youngest group, and they've had the best bow holds. They've managed to get a wonderful sound, and then you can teach them the notes. It's like with a younger student, you want to do kind of one thing at a time. And so if you can give them a really good foundation, then they have such a muscle memory of how to make the sound. You don't have to talk about it quite so much. It's maybe something that I check in with every student for a few minutes at the beginning of their lesson. And then we move on from there.
There's a great book that called Playing the String Game, I think by Phyllis Young. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book, but that it's got all sorts of, essentially games, but they're all about some sort of physical concept on the instrument. I think she's a cellist, but a lot of them seem to apply really well to bass.
Koosh ball is one of my favorite ones. I got that one from Tanya. And so the koosh ball, you could use anything to throw, but the koosh ball, if it runs into somebody or somebody's instrument, it's not going to hurt. And so basically, you toss the ball, but you're going across the front of your body like you're making a down bow. So you'd be tossing sideways to somebody. And it just, you could think of throwing the frisbee. Paul Ellison is big into throwing the frisbee for German bow, just to help them get the feeling of connection, rather than what usually tends to happen is when you pick up the bow and you say, put your finger here, and you give them about 900 instructions, and all of a sudden they're clutching onto this stick like they're going to drop it, and there's a lot of tension.
Do you use anything either for French or German bow to help with like bow buddies or any of those kind of rubber grips or anything like that, or places, things to like put your finger on this sticker or that sort of thing? Is there anything that you've tried or tend to use?
I think it depends on the student, and some of them need it and some of them don't. I definitely start, with a younger student, I start bow holds without a bow in their hand. And so they get a physical memory of the thumb and the second finger for a French bow. We use pencils. They'll do a bow hold with a pencil so they don't have to balance a long stick. A stuffed animal, even like a carrot, anything where they can just have the feeling of that. I'm not a big believer of I've seen the bow buddies, but I feel like everyone's hand is a little bit shaped differently. And so once a student's got the frog in their hand, then I'll help them find the place where their fingers need to go. Once in a while, I will put stickers on and maybe put a dot on their finger so that they can line up the dots and just so that they can get a physical memory of where that goes.
How on earth? So you're teaching these students, and then do you have 7 kids of your own? Is that what Ira told me? Wow. So how do you carve out? And again, this might be, how do you carve out practice time for yourself, or how, and with that practice time you managed to carve out, what do you do in that time? I mean, time must be at a premium for you.
Yes. Just a few things. I mean, I think it's changed as I've been going through, because my oldest is 21 years old and my youngest is 2.5. So I think it was hardest at the very beginning when we just had one, because there's a huge change that happens. And so I used to hire a babysitter for 12 hours a week. So I knew at least I could count on that time. And then plus I needed to do, other practicing as well. And so just having that in my schedule, and I was paying for it, it kind of makes it motivating that you're going to use that time. And, I always had, things that I'm working on. But I found, through the years, the thing that makes me practice the most is taking a leap of faith and scheduling a recital. Or, George would ask me, would you come teach? And the teachers at his workshops, you play a half recital, or a couple times I did a full recital there. And so you keep on scheduling things like that. The ISB presentation I mentioned that Heather Larden and I did in Rochester with the 3 Bach gamba sonatas, that had me getting up and practicing at 6 a.m. before my kids got up. And I'm not a morning person, I will let you know that. And practicing at night from 10 to midnight before, after my kids have gone to bed. And I think people need to make choices. My house is messy. My kids have to do some of their own laundry. And, I guess I made the choice that playing the bass is something that's important to me. And we just found a way to make it work.
I find it so hard to find my own practice time, and I don't have 0 kids, so it's remarkable. But I like that the babysitter time. That's if you're paying for that time,
you have a deadline, you have something coming up. I have found that I'll find a way to make it work. Yeah. That's basically it. So if I'm sitting there thinking, oh man, I'm so tired, I'm so busy, I don't have time for this, then I think things take the amount of time that you allow for them. So I think also the fact that you have a babysitter, or maybe that you only have 2 hours and you don't have the whole day to practice, has forced me anyway to learn to be a lot more efficient with what I'm doing in that time.
Yeah, it's like work expands to fill the container you give it. So if you have 12 hours free in a day, you might be getting 2 hours worth of work done in those 12 hours.
I used to work really hard when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student. If I knew then what I know now, I could get even more done.
Something that I get asked a lot with, especially concerned parents, they're sending their 17-year-old, 18-year-old kids off to college, and the child's interested in music, wants to do music. And for me, it seems like even though I ended up going back to school and getting a music ed degree and going back, 0% of my students want to do a music ed degree. They all want to do performance. And then oftentimes parents ask, is this a good idea? What are the career prospects like? Do you start to look at the numbers? And if you look very objectively, it could depending on how you look at the numbers, it can be kind of a bleak outlook. What do you tell parents that have kids that are wanting to go pursue music?
Well, it's interesting because, I also teach at Oberlin Conservatory. And so, I'm right in there with the music majors, and trying to help people get into summer festivals and into, good graduate schools and things like that. And then I've also, I've got my younger students and I've got my high school students that are thinking, should I go into music? Or, is this something that I'm going to keep, but I'm going to go into something else? And, I actually try to handle this by having them discover what they need to themselves. It's not that I don't talk about it, but I try to send them out into the bass world so that they see who's out there. If they go to the bass convention and they hear, the winner of the Young Bassist competition play, then they can see what it is that they see it, they hear it. They've been to, if they've gone to Peabody Bass Works and there's, 80 students there that you can see, they need to get out there, out of my studio and go to bass camp and, just see who's out there. And I actually have had very few uncomfortable conversations as a result of that.
I think people can they get into a scene like that and they see what the level is, and unless they're have extremely intense blinders on, they kind of realize.
And I hesitate as a teacher to say to a person, you don't have what it takes, because I really feel that in order to be successful, a person needs to be able to own where they are and see it themselves. And so I see myself as a guide along that process. I've heard of teachers in the past that have said, to one of my friends, well, you can't play the bass because you have a double jointed thumb. That's utterly incomprehensible to me. Why would anybody, and this very talented person and is working professionally in an orchestra now. So, I remember hearing that early on and thinking I really need to be careful if you're in a position of power and authority, be careful what you say, because if you cast judgment on a person like that, it can be really damaging.
I've thought about that so many times. And I've one of my first serious students, he said, where should I go to music, or where should I apply to music school? And I just off the cuff named like 3 or 4 schools, right? I was just like drinking my coffee, and he applied to those exact schools. And I realized I just shaped this person's life like with this offhanded remark, right? And yeah. I'm sure you've had the same thing, like just kind of tapping into what you said, like in a way, it's like people progress the way that they progress, and they're on their own journey, and you're a guide in that journey. And like, who am I to, I feel like it's not really my place. It's my place to make them aware of what's out there. But I've had students that I swear, if I really sat down and had thought about it, I thought they're probably not going to make it, or whatever make it means. And those have been some of my most successful students. Yes. Because they just developed in a certain way. And I've just gotten so much less. I can't imagine like making like a blanket proclamation to somebody at 15 or 16. You can't go on because you're double jointed or something like that.
Or even now in this day and age when people are starting at age 5, think about my student. I don't know what she's going to do, but if she's 12 now and she's playing Bottesini concerto and Bach unaccompanied cello suites at pitch, what is she going to sound like when she's 18? I don't know. But at the same time, what if someone had said to David Allen Moore when he started playing classical bass, so-called classical bass, in college, you started too late, there's no hope for you. Nobody said that, thank goodness, and he's one of the superstars out there right now. There's another student, former student of mine named Mike Forfia, who just won the ISB jazz competition at the last convention, and he started when he played electric bass, and he started the upright bass as a senior in high school. And how many times have I seen that and seen that it was really hard and people couldn't do it and, ended up doing something else. Where there's a will, there's a way, and people need to have the right kind of support.
Well, and that's such a great. I forgot that David started it as late as he did on the upright, and that's such. And like Scott Pingle here in San Francisco started like the end of his senior year in high school, and in a way, it's really exciting right now because you have these people that are starting at 5 in the Vance system and going through, but it's still not as we're still kind of in the early days versus violin. Like I don't hear about very many violinists starting at age 17 and becoming principal of the San Francisco Symphony. But bass, I think there's still kind of that possibility on the instrument. Well, I got one more question for you, and it's kind of like my one traditional question I have for people, and it's if you could. You've done a lot. You've played professionally. You didn't want to teach. You ended up teaching. You have had all these great experiences. If you could go back and give 18-year-old Tracy some advice, what might that be?
I think for me personally, what I would say is to worry less and enjoy the ride more. I think the working hard is necessary, and I always did that. That would be the advice that I would have for myself. Also to take some chances, take a leap of faith, schedule that recital, live dangerously, musically dangerously.
I love it. I think I told myself that exact thing last night. It's like, Jason, worry less, enjoy life more. Because you just get caught up and look back 10 years ago and I think, what was I worried about? I was so consumed about this little minutia thing of my job, or am I going to get called for this gig? And then you zoom out and you're like,
and I think at age 18, the bass world for me was one very narrow focus. And the longer that I've gone along, the more I've realized that there's a lot more out there, that there are a lot of happy people in the music business. Some of them are playing in orchestras. Some of them are doing a lot of other things. And that, it's just this journey that we're all on. And, it's better to be on that journey, being curious, being open to new ideas. Some of the people that have been inspiring me lately, I don't know if I didn't mention this before, but I got a grant. Actually, I applied for a grant through Oberlin College. They support their faculty with travel and study grants. And I had the opportunity last spring to go observe Caroline Emery's teaching for a week. And then I got to go to Paris and study with Francois Rabat for a week. So that was kind of like a real bass spa time for me. I had no kids with me, and it was really just being a student of the double bass and thinking about double bass pedagogy. And, that was just, I guess, being around Francois at age 85, who's still composing music. And he, when I was there, he played the piece for me that's going to be one of the required pieces in the ISB solo competition for the oldest age group, and how excited he was about that and all the new technology. And I thought, wow, to him, I'm a really young person with lots of potential. And so I think it's important for me to think of myself still as being a student.
Thank you so much, Tracy. So great to chat with you. Check out the show notes for links to everything Tracy's up to. And that's going to do it for another episode of Contrabass Conversations. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can check out our 10-year and counting archive at contrabassconversations.com. Join the great conversations we're having at the Contrabass Conversations Facebook community group. You can just go to contrabassconversations.com/community for that. Reach out, send me an email, feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I'd love to hear from you. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.